very happy to have the opportunity and the honor to welcome and introduce Derek Hook and Sheldon George, who are two people that I had collaborated with, and that the work of both of them I admire, and I'm happy to have the opportunity of have them with us today for the discussion. The order of the presentations will, I think Sheldon and Derek agreed that Derek will be presenting first, followed by Sheldon. So perhaps to make the discussion more fluid, I will introduce both of them right now, and then we can start our work directly. So Derek Hook is an associate professor of psychology at Duquesne University and an extraordinary professor of psychology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He is the author of A Critical Psychology of the Colonial, published in 2011, Post-Apartheid Conditions, published in 2013, and 6 Moments in Lacan, published in 2017. In addition to acting as co-editor with Callum Neal and Steve Van Hule in the Lacan, Bulgar Lacan series, he's also the editor of Lie on Your Wounds, the collected prison correspondence of Robert Sobukwe, and the co-editor with Sheldon George of a collection that I had the pleasure to be part of, and the same for Michelle Stephen, on Lacan on race. This is forthcoming. I think we are having this conversation today in a very precise moment where they're about to send out the manuscript. So this is a very pertinent discussion what we're having today. And this collection engages the writings of Lacan in connection with race from different perspectives. Derek Hook also has a YouTube channel that not only is very pedagogical and does a wonderful job in spreading the word of Lacan, it's also a lot of fun, and also Duchamp. And I noticed that some images are in what looks like a garage with some instruments that call up a sort of Duchampian installation. So we could have an artistic approach to the Lacanian transmission. Our second presenter today is Sheldon George, a professor of English and chair of English, the English department at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. He's a scholar of Lacanian psychoanalytic theory and African American literature and culture. His publications include the co-edited special issue of the journal Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society. One was titled Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Interventions into Culture and Politics, and the other issue was titled African Americans and Inequality. His book, Trauma and Race, a Lacanian study of African American racial identity, was published in 2016 and remains an important source for work, I think, Lacanian work in psychoanalysis from a political perspective, and a very explicit one. I recommend it strongly. He's co-editor also with Jane Wyatt of Reading Contemporary Black, British, and African American Women Writers, Race, Ethics, Narrative Form. This is a book from 2020. And co-editor of the forthcoming with Derek Hook, Lacan and Race, Racism, Identity, and Psychoanalytic Theory, coming in 2021. And with that, I welcome our first speaker for today, Derek Hook.
Great, thanks everyone. It's lovely to have the opportunity to spend some time with you on a happy day. I'm going to try and do two things in the time that is allotted to me. I want to think about a perspective question that we could pose psychoanalytically back to Afropessimism. And I also then want to suggest a Lacanian supplement to a crucial conceptualization within Afropessimism. It's kind of a maybe classic disclaimer of sorts, but just to note that in a sense, I don't really feel defensive about making arguments against Afropessimism, and for a number of reasons. One of them is that it seems to me that Afropessimism is prescient and importantly radical relative to the tepid and often lackluster set of theorizations of racism that we find particularly in my, as it were, home discipline of psychology. So in that respect, I think the radicalism of Afropessimism should be welcomed. And I think there's things that we can do with Afropessimism. My other reticence is that I'm a white South African, essentially. And when I was reading Frank's book, I was startled to find out that some of the examples that he was drawing on were from my alma mater, my home university in South Africa. And it was a kind of sobering realization to get a sense that he and I may well have crossed paths, although we would have been in such different worlds, me presumably in some cocoon of white liberalism, that had I met Frank, probably we would have been a little bit like two ships in the night. Nevertheless, having made those qualifications, there was in the last week or so a kind of niggling question that started to emerge for me. And that niggling question is not so much a Lacanian question, maybe it's just a basic Freudian tenet. And this Freudian tenet kept on coming back to me. So in order to introduce that, let's just note a familiar foundational assertion made by Afropessimism that over the last 4 sessions, we've all become very well acquainted with. And that is the idea that blackness is consigned to a non-position, that blackness is paradigmatically non-human. And this assertion, of course, follows on from an aligned notion that blackness is, via the historical legacy and ongoing reality of slavery, epistemic or otherwise, that blackness is condemned to a condition of social death. So we should let those ideas resonate, but here's the Freudian idea. Freud has, amongst other ideas, when he's thinking about notions of anti-Semitism, racism, conflict, he has the idea of the narcissism of minor differences. And if we take Freud's notion of the narcissism of minor differences seriously, then we can say that some of the most virulent forms of hatred are not fundamentally directed at a class of others, but are directed precisely and emerge precisely because there is a perception that the ostensible other is somehow similar, problematically too similar, too much the same as the self. Hence the need for efforts at construing and experiencing the other person as categorically, as fundamentally other. The insistence on the status of the other's fundamentally other or non-human does not then proceed from the perception and assumption of pure otherness or pure externality in Freud, at least within the notion of the narcissism of minor differences. Rather, the insistence on the status of the other as fundamentally other takes its distinctive libidinal dynamism and force because of an initial perception of potential likeness, of potential sameness. We could argue then that some of the horrific extremes of anti-Black racism would not assume the degree that they have assumed historically if there was a confirmation and acceptance of pure difference, or simply a kind of absolute confidence and acceptance in the racist mind of superiority. The idea that the other is somehow inferior or less than human is, of course, an important one in the history of racism, but I think via Freud, psychically, in terms of the psychic life of power, we also need to take seriously the idea of the narcissism of minor differences. The status of the other as somehow inferior, as less, has at some psychical level, one could argue, not been fundamentally affirmed or confirmed. You could say then that this might help us account for racism's continuous ongoing attempts at negation, at dehumanization. Put differently, we might say that the consciousness of racial superiority is never finally, utterly confirmed in its beliefs. Otherwise, presumably, it would not need to constantly reenact and perform its superiority, as it seems so intently and necessarily to want to do. Anti-Black racism derived its libidinal ferocity, we might say, rather from the necessity of disproving a kind of already acknowledged potentiality of sameness. Now, despite the prescience and the critical force of Afropessimism, I was left wondering if it neglects somewhat this particular libidinal dynamism, whereby, following Fanon, racism is never simply a rejection of the other, a demotion of the other to a subservient status, although it is obviously that as well, but it also entails a more complex braiding of envy, desire, and libidinal investment. Stuart Hall's commentary on Black Skin, White Masks makes this idea more evident yet. The psychic dimensions of colonial racism, despite its undeniable brutality and dehumanizing facets, retains always that aspect of desire. Racism, in other words, and this is in Fanon, should be approached, certainly psychoanalytically, as always in part a formation of desire. Now, of course, this is not to jettison Wilderson's account of blackness as paradigmatically non-human, for the simple reason that not all of racism can be understood with reference to Freud's idea of the narcissism of minor differences. Moreover, there are, of course, times when Wilderson is well aware of how blackness is for whiteness a kind of erotogenic or erotic object. So I'm presenting this question precisely as a question rather than some kind of definitive form of critique. But my idea here is that by focusing on something of the libidinal dynamism, not just the libidinal economy, but the libidinal dynamism of racism, is that it is perhaps the case that the thesis of blackness as non-human holds better at some levels of analysis than at others. It may also suggest that some of these issues need still to be approached along the lines of a psychoanalytic register. This, I think, helps because it perhaps highlights some of the psychical dimensions of racism that may be somewhat left or somewhat undeveloped within Afropessimism. Now, that argument may not sound all that convincing, but there's an interesting moment in Afropessimism, in Frank's book, where he makes reference to the Lacanian concept of jouissance. It's a really instructive example, a really helpful one. I certainly will use it in future years in teaching. The idea, as you'll remember, is that there is a sadistic mode of jouissance that the slave owner obtains, and by the humiliation, the torture, the punishment of the slave. This sadistic mode of jouissance helps fortify the paradigm of blackness as social death. So here's the quote, page 92. The jouissance that constitutes the violence of anti-blackness secures the order of life itself. Dramatic assertion. I don't want to necessarily unpick that, although I do want to say, couldn't we argue that surely the inherent logic that makes these examples of jouissance so disturbing is that the jouissance would not be so great if there was an acceptance of the racial other's non-human status. The sadistic gains of humiliating and torturing someone, definitively non-human, are surely less spectacular than those enacted against a human subject. The unconscious concession of racism, one might argue, is that the other is indeed somewhat like me, instantiates aspects of myself, indeed instantiates my own loathsome jouissance. And that is in part why they are so fundamentally blameworthy, so fundamentally hateable. In some ways, we might even say that this is a more disturbing thesis than the notion of a type of paradigmatic fixity pertaining to blackness as social death. The racism as desire thesis arguably entails more by way of virulence and more by way of an ongoing need for violence or racist violence, racist actings out of its own attempt to secure, to perform white primacy, white superiority. Now, there's going to be lots of questions about that. I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time developing that argument, but if we were going to try and do a little broad stroke sketch of where that might go, we might develop the argument by opposing on one side psychoanalysis as a theory of libidinal dynamism against the Afro-pessimist notion of a reliance on a paradigmatic fixity of how blackness is paradigmatically defined by social death. So let's leave that. I mean, we could come back to it. And I think there's also a defense of the Afro-pessimist position here, which would say that some of that dynamism may be inherent within an Afro-pessimist position, whereby the ongoing attempt to secure life thereby excluding blackness, which is consigned to social death, requires a similar form of ongoing performative violence. Although then again, from the talk last time, Frank was very clear about not involving the notion of the performative in how we think slavery. But that's a critical hunch. If we wish, we can come back to it. What I'd like to do now in my remaining time is to turn to what I think is an intriguing and underdeveloped point of convergence, a moment where a key postulate of Afropessimism might profit from a psychoanalytic supplementation. In order to do this, to develop a kind of Lacanian supplementation of one facet of Afropessimism, it helps to turn to a mediator, a third point of theory. And that mediator, if we're going to try and find a mediator between Afropessimism and Lacanian psychoanalysis, it would be hard to find a better one than Fanon and Fanon's work. We could be more specific. We're not just thinking about Fanon in the most general sense, but we're thinking more particularly of Fanon's concept of the zone of non-being. Now, the zone of non-being has, of course, been important to the general formation, the developments within Afropessimism, precisely because it is seen at times as yet another exemplar of this paradigmatic zone of social death. Patterson's kind of inaugural thesis that slavery can be seen in this way. So although many colleagues will be familiar with it, it's in the opening pages of Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. I just want to remind people, if and maybe not everyone is familiar with it, but this is the evocative phrase that Fanon utilizes to introduce this concept, which arguably remains an unfinished, underdeveloped concept. He says, there is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an utterly naked declivity where an authentic upheaval can be born. In most cases, the Black man lacks the advantage of being able to accomplish this descent into a real hell. Now, I set out trying to gather and collect a whole series of commentaries on this passage. And there's a lot that's been written about it. But what, up until a certain period in Fanon's scholarship, ended up being the definitive engagement was really the work of Lewis Gordon. And Lewis Gordon offers a series of interesting, although phenomenologically existential interpretations of this idea. But for me, what I noted was in many of those interpretations, what seemed to be tacitly and not so tacitly avoided, was that the factor of agency that I think that Fanon is clearly reaching towards was not really addressed in much detail or in a convincing way, or certainly in a way that foregrounded the possibility. Now, the paradox that you will have noted in Fanon's idea of the zone of non-being is that there's a radical form of agency to be found precisely within the conditions of death-bound subjectivity. Okay, agency within death-bound subjectivity. The argument I would like to try and flesh out, and I'm not going to be able to do all of it here, but I have a paper on the topic which I'll email to Evan, so hopefully he can make it available if people are interested. The argument that I want to develop here is that the type of death-bound agency that Fanon is speaking about, it seems to me to call to mind the Lacanian death drive. I will go further here and to say that it's only a psychoanalytic and indeed Lacanian theorization of the death drive that really enables us to grasp the most radical potential of this theory within Fanon, the zone of non-being. So just to give you an indication of where I'm going, I'm going to be drawing on arguments within Lacanian social theory, which read the death drive as a mode of ethical fidelity to a cause. It helps briefly here to note Slavoj Žižek's claim that the death drive is the psychoanalytic name for the innermost radical possibility of a human being. Death drive is as such, at least in this, his Hegelian reading of Lacan's notion of the death drive, an agency of radical negativity. So that's a little abstract. Let me try and concretize things. I've got a few examples, and one of them, funnily enough, is provided by an earlier extract from Frank Wilderson's reflections on what it was like to be a revolutionary in South Africa. So my first example comes from Steve Biko. I've got a pile of books. This is the next one. Steve Biko, the leader of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa, was interviewed in 1977. As many of you will know, he was eventually murdered by the South African security police. But prior to that, before he was imprisoned and tortured and killed, he was interviewed. And in an interview, he ended up commenting on what he foresaw, what he thought would happen. He thought he would be tortured, and he had this to say. The security police go on and on with a towel around your neck, saying, speak, and you say nothing, and the bloody brutes are not trained well enough to realize when enough is enough. So by the time they release the towel, you have been dead for a couple of minutes. Now, of course, that choice of words to a Lacanian ear, to a psychoanalytic ear, might sound a little odd. This choice of words has a conjunction of the seemingly present condition, they release the towel, with a description offered in the past tense, you have already been dead. This to me connotes not only an unusual proximity between life and death, okay, one that made me think of Fanon's articulation of the zone of non-being, but it also evoked for me what for Lacan is the distinctive temporality of subjective transformation, the future anterior, that tense of the time of I will have been. Biko doesn't just comment, or didn't just comment, on the prospect of his own death. He also commented on what he referred to as the bravery of the township youth. So he means the revolutionary youth of Black youth of South Africa during apartheid. This is what he had to say. The dramatic thing about their bravery is that they have discovered or accepted that the bond between life and death is absolute. Your method of death can be a politicizing thing. So you die in the riots. For a hell of a lot of them, in fact, there's really nothing to lose. And if you can overcome your personal fear for death, then you're on your way. So those are two examples where Biko is, I think, evoking not just the proximity of life and death, but the constant prospect, the very real reality of death, and not just the death as a conceptual entity, but death almost as if it has already happened, right? Death as if it has already happened, if it's a constant possibility. And furthermore, the prospect of a type of life that is made possible via existing within precisely a condition of death. Hence the idea of a death-bound subjectivity and a form of agency that might be made possible via that. Now I'm referring to another book. This one is called Biko Lives. It's published in 2008, and it's where I first came across Frank's work. He has a chapter here called Biko and the Problematic of Presence. And in this chapter, he gives an example, which again chimes with some of the two examples that I've already given. He is describing an event that happens in June 1992. A comrade, a revolutionary comrade that he is working with by the name of Ronnie Casseroles has co-chaired a mass action committee. There's 100 or so people there, almost all of whom are Black, maybe with the exception of Casseroles. The event begins with struggle songs, which are performed, says Frank, in such a riotous and jubilant fashion that by the time the actual meeting gets underway, one sensed, as he puts it, a quiet tension in the face of Casseroles and his co-chairs. In other words, the more senior leadership of this, meeting. On the agenda...
You fucking asshole.
I didn't hear that. So if I'm to continue, on the agenda for the meeting was a planned mass excursion. Dozens of buses filled with demonstrators were to travel to the border of a homeland, the homeland called Ciskei, where they would disembark, hold a rally, followed by a march, before then crashing through the border fence, thus liberating the people of the homeland. Okay, so if you don't know much about the history of apartheid, homelands were enclaves that the government had made and claimed these are Black homelands. Black people will live there, okay? They were artificially constructed and it was all part of segregation. So what was being planned at this meeting was a mass excursion where everyone there would push over the fence and walk, liberate the people of the homeland. Anyways, let's get back to Wilderson's telling of the anecdote. At a particular point in the meeting, things seem to be getting out of hand, at least from the perspective of Casseroles and his co-chairs. Another round of singing and chanting breaks out. Casserels exits the room to consult an urgent intelligence report. Upon returning, and now I'm going to return to cite Frank directly, Casserel says he has just received word that were we to actually pass the motion and to cross the Ciskei border en masse with our belligerent mass, the South African police force would open fire on us with live ammunition. To Comrade Casserel's horror, the room erupts in cheers and applause. This, I'm thinking, is not the response his intelligence was meant to elicit. He goes on to offer some more theoretical reflections on what has happened. He says, the divergence of our joy in what appeared to be his anxiety was expressed as divergent structures of feeling, symptomatic of irreconcilable differences in how and where blacks are positioned ontologically in relationship to non-blacks. Perhaps the bullets that were promised us did not manifest within our psyches as lethal deterrents because they were manifested as gifts, rare gifts of recognition, acknowledgement that we did form an ensemble of human capacity. I'm not saying that we welcome the prophecy of our collective death. I'm arguing that the threat of our collective death, a threat in response to the gesture of our collective, our living will, made us feel as though we were alive. Okay, that's the end of that example. We've got two from Biko, one from Frank himself. Last quoted example before we move on to the Lacanian theory, which I think helps augment and develop some of what is being said. This example is more theoretical in nature, and it comes from Achille Mbembe's commentary on Fanon. In Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics, okay, that's not Necropolitics, but I like to show a book. It's another Achille Mbembe book, it'll have to do. In Necropolitics, he has a chapter called Fanon's Pharmacy. And the objective in that chapter is to explore the role of violence in Fanon's work alongside Fanon's clinical commitment as a revolutionary psychiatrist. Mbembe presents his chapter in the following terms. He says, we have Fanon, whose considerations on destruction and violence on the one hand, and on the therapeutic process and desire for unlimited life on the other, form the basis for his theory of radical decolonization. Fanon's work envisages radical decolonization from the angle of movement and of violent labor. This labor aims at the principle of life. It aims to create the new, and yet it involves violence. End of quote. So a question emerges here. If we are to locate Fanon on the side of unlimited life, how should this be reconciled with the violent labor required for the project of decolonization? Okay, so those are our examples, one theoretical extract and a series of examples from apartheid South Africa. Let's now think a little bit about the Lacanian theory of the death drive. And in order to do that, one of my last books, Seminar 7, Lacan's Ethics of Psychoanalysis, includes, as his 21st chapter of the seminar, a chapter entitled Antigone Between Two Deaths. And that chapter, Antigone Between Two Deaths, includes a section entitled The Death Drive Illustrated. Now, of course, many of you will be more than familiar with this, but let's just give a brief extract so we can make sure that I'm not making all this stuff up. In that section of his seminar, Lacan famously discusses the situation that Antigone finds herself in after insisting that she wants to, against the wishes of King Creon, against the wishes of the city, to bury her brother. This is what Lacan says about this situation. And you're probably guessing what I'm essentially doing here is trying to say, if we've got, on the one hand, Fanon's notion of the zone of non-being, a concept which is important in the foundations, I think, in the foundations of Afro-pessimism. And on the other hand, we've got this articulation within Lacan also of a zone of sorts, a zone between the two deaths, an ethical zone, a zone that is enabling of a kind of radical form of agency. What happens if we overlap these two? Do they speak to each other? Can they be articulated with one another? I think they can, maybe with some provisos, but let's go back to the Lacan quote. Lacan is talking now about Antigone. He says, bear with me, it's a lengthy quote. Her punishment will consist in her being shut up or suspended in the zone between life and death. Although she is not dead, she is eliminated from the world of the living. From Antigone's point of view, life can only be approached, can only be lived or thought about from the place of that limit where her life is already lost, where she is already on the other side. And it is from this place that Antigone makes the chorus lose its head, makes the just appear unjust, and makes the chorus transgress all limits, including casting aside any respect it might have for the edicts of the city. Just want to repeat that last part, casting aside any respect that the chorus, the Greek chorus, might have for the edicts of the city. Now, of course, the objection arises. On the one hand, I've given some harrowing examples, real political examples of anti-blackness, perhaps at its most extreme, in fact, examples where death is imminent and where there is certainly a powerful dehumanization that is occurring. This example in Lacan is something from the Western canon. Okay, it's an example, a fiction example from famous Greek tragedy. And yet, I know we can make them say, well, they're not quite the same thing. But nevertheless, I think we can do some work with it. I think this example is still illuminating in some ways. How so? Well, the imprisoned Antigone, while literally alive, is effectively symbolically dead for Lacan. She has, firstly, been ejected from the social order and is as such effectively living a life of social death. Okay, she's living a life of symbolic death. Having been condemned to execution, she has secondly passed the point of no return. So she is effectively a dead woman walking. And yet it is from within this condition of symbolic social death that a new and radically transformative order of life, a new form of agency, becomes possible. Antigone's perspective from the place of death, so reminiscent of Steve Biko's remark about being already dead, yields a very different standpoint on life. It is one which potentially enables a form of symbolic life that exceeds death. And you'll remember in Biko's comments, he says, your form of death can be a politicizing thing. Antigone's perspective, Antigone's experience within this zone between life and death entails the prospect that the existing symbolic order might itself be altered by virtue of such a sacrifice. This alteration, this transformation may occur via the repeated markings of a death, as we have in fact seen from the life of and the death of Steve Biko, but it can also be made possible, this alteration in a given symbolic order, by a newness, by a birth, a nascence, which emerges by virtue of the fact that the symbolic order has been accordingly shifted. This at least seems to be the possibility that the illustrative example of Antigone makes possible. It is, furthermore, via the death drive that all unconscious commitments to the status quo of an existing symbolic order can be overcome. This is a more political point and doesn't seem necessarily to be hugely overt in the Lacan. But I think it is there because if we remember, of course, the famous crescendo of all of this theoretical exposition is that Antigone is an example of someone who exists with a purified desire, a desire for that she does not give way on, which in many ways, I think, is equivalent to saying that she has, in fact, essentially become the subject of death drive, rather than being the subject of alienated desires. This idea that to be between the two, between life and death, in this zone between the two deaths, the symbolic death and an effective biological death. This idea that there may be some agency, there may be something newness that emerges, is something that I think is crucial, and it's also crucial in a political sense, because if the death drive means that one might be purified or might interrogate all unconscious commitments to the status quo, then it clearly does have political implications. I found a series of examples of this, but the most riveting, the most powerful example I found actually came out of, unexpectedly, a part of Fanon. We know that in the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon asks this haunting question, psychoanalytic question, what does the Black man want? It's a question which, disturbingly, soberingly, he gives an answer and he says, the Black man wants to be white. Now, that question is echoed later in the book, and one of the most dramatic ways in which that question is responded to comes right towards the end of the book, and Fanon provides this response. Later in the text, he comments, once he, the black man, has discovered the white man in himself, he kills him. That to me seems a nice exemplification of the political ramifications of death drive. In other words, and I'm going to start to wrap up now, one way of eradicating such alienating desires is to enter the zone of non-being, which via Lacan, we can conceptualize also as the zone between life and death, the zone which opens up the prospect of the agency of radical negativity. The death drive brings about the prospect of the demise of alienated desires, just as it can be said to suspend the hold of the symbolic upon the subject. With reference to Antigone, we can see how by persisting beyond the limits of the pleasure principle, beyond the limits of her own symbolic death, she effectively ceases to be what she was and what the symbolic order had determined her to be. I think that's also the crucial point. It's not just that she may be transformed by being subject of death drive, but also that she is able to change, to shift to some extent what the symbolic order had determined her to be. Another way of putting this is to say death-bound positionality, death-bound subjectivity might itself be a precondition for the emergence of something that is genuinely new, for a different order of life. Indeed, as Gilles Deleuze would have it, the death drive is a properly ontological form of affirmation. So that's the central thesis, how death drive might be a way of understanding the intimation that Fanon has, this idea that he intuits, but doesn't really properly, in a sense, develop, that the zone of non-being is agentic, enables a radical, revolutionary agency. We have then, with the idea of the death drive as a mode of surplus life that imbues the subject with agency, an agency of radical negativity, a response to Mbembe's paradoxical comments on Fanon. His paradoxical comments on the relationship between creativity and violence in Fanon. Mbembe, to recall, refers to a type of violent labor. Fanon's decolonizing project, he says, is premised on a desire for unlimited life, and it aims at the principle of life, at the creation of the new. This requires for Mbembe a violent labor. The Lacanian name for this violent labor is the death drive. I'm going to conclude. When I was piecing together bits and pieces for the talk, I was reminded of attending a clinical case presentation some years ago. And towards the end of the talk, a more senior clinician said something that's stuck with me. He said, sometimes the best thing that a clinician can do is simply echo a patient's view that their own situation is hopeless. This warning against optimism, against hope, when such aspirations, hopeful, optimistic aspirations, take on the form of a defensive formation of feel-good imaginaries, is, I think, shared by Lacanian theory and Afropessimism alike. The same holds in the case of imaginary identifications which assume that your plight is my plight, that I share your suffering. To such imaginarizations, Afropessimism responds with the answer, which resonates as much with the psychoanalytic ethics of singularity as with the urgency of political ethics. And that answer is no.